The focus of this lecture is the first triumvirate through the Ides of March. So our time period in this lecture is 59 BC to March 15th, 44 BC. In 59 BC, three of Rome's wealthiest patricians came together to form a political and military alliance called the First Triumvirate to rule Rome. These men were Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. These three men formed an alliance in 59 BC called the First Triumvirate to oversee the Roman Republic. It is the First Triumvirate that puts the final nail in the coffin of the Roman Republic. As we've seen in a previous lecture, the Roman Republic was supposed to be governed by two men called consuls who are popularly elected annually. The First Triumvirate assumes or takes control over Rome in 59 BC. Three men assuming control of Rome: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Each of these men was extremely well known and extremely rich. So what did the Roman people know about the First Triumvirate prior to 59 BC? Julius Caesar was famed as a general, meaning that he had his own army because he was a multimillionaire even by our standards today. He was able to afford an army all by himself, so his soldiers were loyal to him, not to the Roman Republic. He had also at one point been elected a consul. He was a priest of the Olympic gods, of course imported from Greece, and as a priest in Rome, Caesar had staged many popular religious festivals and parades. He was also famous as an orator or a speech maker and as a writer. More about his important work in just a bit. Pompey was also a famed military commander. He had put down before 59 BC an important revolt by slaves called the Rebellion of Spartacus. Crassus was also famed as a military commander. In 59 BC, these three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, swore an oath of loyalty to each other to put the other two men's interests ahead of their own. Of course, each one of these guys had more than a healthy dose of ambition, so the First Triumvirate was doomed to fail. In 59 BC, when the First Triumvirate assumed control of Rome, Caesar and Crassus immediately left Rome to pursue other opportunities. They left in control of the Roman Republic on their behalf Pompey. Caesar and Crassus left Rome as generals with armies to gain more territory for Rome. Crassus went to an area that the Romans called Parthia. We know that today as the modern-day country of Iraq, or as we've been calling it so far in our discussions this term, Mesopotamia. He would not be successful there. He would actually die in battle in Parthia. Caesar went north of Italy to an area that was inhabited by what the Romans called barbarians. Those are non-Romans, non-citizens. That area was called by the Romans Gaul. Today, that is the modern-day country of France. Staying behind in Rome to oversee the Roman Republic on behalf of the First Triumvirate was Pompey, and the Senate was thrilled about this. They did not like Caesar or Crassus, especially Caesar. Caesar was one of those men that people either loved or hated. Most people weren't wishy-washy in their feelings about Caesar. They either admired and respected him or detested him. Most of the Senate disliked Julius Caesar for a couple of reasons. They feared his popularity. Caesar was absolutely adored by the Roman Republic, but also they had been humiliated by him in their own personal lives. Caesar was a great conqueror of not just territory, but women also, and some of his conquests included the senators' wives. So they feared his popularity. They had been humiliated personally, many of them, by Julius Caesar, but they also feared his ambition. Most of the Senate felt pretty sure that Caesar aspired to be more than one of three men sharing Rome, that he aspired complete dictatorial control over Rome. Some suggested that he wanted to be a dictator for life, or in other words, a king, which the Roman Republic was against. So when Pompey was left behind to oversee the Roman Republic, the Senate breathed a sigh of relief. They were happy that Pompey was the man left behind because they recognized in him a weakness of character, that he was somewhat malleable, or another way to put it is moldable. He was the kind of guy that could be bent and shaped into what the Senate wanted. They saw him as a yes man, as someone that they could work with or more likely control. So Pompey oversees the Roman Republic while Caesar heads off to Gaul, or modern-day France, to win more territory for the Republic, and Crassus goes to Mesopotamia, or Parthia, where he dies fighting for territory for Rome. The first triumvirate then becomes rather quickly a power struggle between Caesar and Pompey. The people of Rome were on the side of Caesar largely. The Senate was behind Pompey. And as we've said before, it's a good thing to have the Senate on your side if you're a Roman politician, because one of the unofficial job functions of the Roman Senate was to assassinate any man they perceived as a danger or a threat to the Roman Republic. Caesar went to Gaul to win territory for Rome. Pompey stayed behind. Let's for just a second talk a little bit about Caesar as a person, because he is really, in this period, the man who has the most impact on Roman politics. As I said just a moment ago, Caesar was famed as a general. He owned his own army, was loyal to him. He had been elected before as a consul. He was a priest, an orator, meaning a speech maker, and people said of Caesar that he was such an effective public speaker that he could move a crowd and incite in them emotions. He could move a crowd to tears or to action. He was especially effective at manipulating a crowd through his gift for speech making. He was also an extremely vain man, and many of you might not would agree with it, but he was a beautiful older man. By the standards of his time, most people found Caesar to be quite attractive. Of course, it didn't hurt that he was powerful and very wealthy also. Caesar took great pride in his appearance. He worked out quite a bit, was extremely athletic, and of course lived the life of a soldier. Therefore, he had a very youthful and athletic physique even into his late years. He was also dark-skinned, as are most Italian people. He was further tanned, of course, by being out in the sun a lot, leading his men in battle. He was balding, and this was something that bothered him, the loss of his hair. So he attempted to camouflage his balding head, not with a comb-over hairstyle, but with a wreath of laurel leaves, which gradually grew bigger and bigger as Caesar's bald spot grew bigger and bigger. He also plucked his body hair, and this was something that women largely did in Rome, but Caesar did this also. He frequented what was called plucking salons in Rome to have all of his body hair plucked out. It's almost like he's sort of like these modern bodybuilders and athletes who wax and remove their body hair so that they can show their rippling muscles to better effect. That's Caesar's motivation for plucking every single stitch of body hair. He also, little known fact, was an epileptic, and he suffered from epilepsy, but the Romans referred to that as the falling down disease. No, the word seizure is not named for Caesar. However, a cesarean section is named for Caesar. Now, of course, Caesar was not the first child in the world to be brought in by a cesarean section, but it was named for him. So Caesar was an epileptic, and it was something that he tried to keep as a secret. It was something that embarrassed him a little bit because he was very concerned about his image and always liked to portray himself as completely and totally in control of every situation. And having a seizure or a falling down episode was something that embarrassed Caesar, which is somewhat ironic. In ancient times, people regarded epilepsy as a sign of genius and greatness because Alexander the Great had also suffered from the falling down sickness, but this was something that Caesar did not want to reveal about himself. Caesar was extremely popular with the women of Rome and was known for being quite the ladies' man. Moving along now that we know a little bit about him as a person, and I know you're wondering, what does that have to do with anything? Well, you'll see how all that plays into the story in just a bit. In 58 BC, Caesar and his army, men that he pays for to be his soldiers, wage war against the Gauls or the French people. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar is fighting a series of wars in Gaul for control of that territory called the Gallic Wars. It has often been questioned why Caesar went to Gaul, what was his motivation, and that has been the stuff of debate since Caesar's lifetime. And modern historians have wondered why. Well, obviously it's for the glory of the conquest, of doing something great to be further famed for. But it also had to do with the fact that, and this is recently discovered information, that there were many gold mines in Gaul. And by winning the gold mines of Gaul, he would be able to have more money to finance all of his goals and ambitions, but also more money to give his soldiers, which would further win the love and admiration of his men. So between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar is completely out of Rome. Rome is under the control of Pompey. In Gaul, Caesar fights right alongside his men. He was not one of those generals who gave orders and watched from the safety of the sidelines. This was a man who was willing to get in there, get his hands dirty, risk his own life to fight for the glory of Rome. And this won him a great deal of respect and admiration from his men. In other words, Caesar wasn't asking his men to do something that he himself was not also willing to do. In the course of the Gallic Wars, Caesar told his men that any booty, B-O-O-T-Y, that means treasure, that they captured, they were allowed to keep. They did not have to give it over to him. So as a result of his exploits in Gaul, Caesar and his men were becoming rich, which of course further made his men willing to fight for him no matter what. Caesar wrote a series of documents called the commentaries, of course written in Latin, the language of the Romans, in the third person, meaning that when Caesar wrote about his exploits in Gaul, he would call himself Caesar, and Caesar led his men into battle, and he fought alongside them. It was never I, me kind of thing. So these commentaries, as they were called, were published in installments back in Rome for people to read and know what was going on in Gaul. And so every time a little segment of the commentaries would come out in Rome, the Roman people wanted to know all about what Caesar was doing in Gaul. And the Senate, of course, they had mixed feelings about this. They're somewhat happy that Caesar is winning territory for the Roman Republic, but they also are a little bit nervous about Caesar's growing wealth and popularity among his soldiers and among the Roman people for his exploits. So they weren't, I guess we could say, as appreciative of Caesar's conquests of Gaul as they should have been. Well, in 50 BC, Caesar sends his final installment of the commentaries to Rome by messenger, and the commentaries are read by the Senate, and what they discover in the last installment of the commentaries is that Caesar has finished the conquest of Gaul. Gaul is now a Roman province. Caesar says in the last installment of the commentaries, I hand to the Roman Republic Gaul. It's conquered, it's ours for the taking. Well, what he expected in return was at least a simple thank you from the Roman people and the Roman Senate. What he got instead was a message delivered to him which told him that he was to leave his army in Gaul and come back to Rome by himself. Now, if you can think through this, you can probably sort of see, hopefully, what the Senate has in mind. If not, then let me just tell you. They want Caesar to come back without an army so that they can kill him. They fear his growing ambition, his growing wealth, his growing popularity. They want him eliminated as a threat to the Roman Republic. After all, they have the yes man Pompey under their control in Rome. They don't want Caesar coming back to Rome to stir up trouble. So in this message, Caesar is told, leave your soldiers on the northern side of the Rubicon River and come across that river back into Roman territory. Before Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the northernmost boundary of Roman territory had been a river called the Rubicon River. So what the Senate is telling him is not thank you for conquering Gaul and giving us this vast territory. What they're telling him is leave your soldiers there. You come across the Rubicon River back to Rome. Caesar, of course, is not an idiot. He's a very smart man. He knows exactly what this message means. And being an effective speaker, he used this message to his benefit. He gathered his soldiers in front of him, and he read to them this message. And he allowed the message to sink in for those soldiers. You know, what is it exactly the Senate is saying here? And he asked the soldiers, what do you think of this? This is the thanks you get for giving 8 years of your life to the conquest of Gaul. You're being told that you have to stay here and I have to go back to Rome. And you know for what? And he asked the men, what did they think? Of course, he had already made up his mind what he was going to do anyway, but he's just trying to buy their support, get them to buy into what his goal is. And the men rally, scream, chant, holler, cross the Rubicon with us. They want to go with him. So Caesar was able to work his soldiers up into a fevered frenzy. They wanted to get back to Rome because they felt they had been slighted, that their leader had been slighted. They wanted revenge for that message. So Caesar and his men stop on the bank of the Rubicon River. And before you start envisioning some big, vast, deep river, it wasn't. It was more like a creek, but they called it a river. So he stands there on the bank of the Rubicon River with his soldiers behind him, and he makes a famous statement. The die is cast, let it fall as it will. Meaning, he's rolling the dice here. He's taking a gamble with his life and the life of his soldiers. He knows that by crossing the Rubicon River, his message is clear. He's bringing an army into the city of Rome, despite what the Senate had ordered him to do. This, of course, means when he crosses the river, taking this gamble with his own life, the life of his soldiers, that he is willing to risk death to fight for control of Rome. By crossing the Rubicon River, he is beginning an active civil war against Pompey. Well, as Caesar marches towards Rome with his huge, vast army of rich, loyal, dedicated soldiers, Pompey freaks out. And this makes good sense. Caesar's army is huge. It's actually bigger than what Pompey has under his own control. The Senate, of course, tells him, don't worry about that. You don't need a personal army. You're the leader of the Roman Republic. We'll give you the whole Roman legions behind you. You will outnumber Caesar. But the problem is, Pompey's army has done nothing for the better part of 10 years. They've sat around, gotten lazy, overweight, out of shape. Caesar's men are in their prime. So as Caesar inches ever closer to Rome, Pompey makes a decision that some of you will fault him for. I know I do. He seems very cowardly in this action. He actually packs up himself, his family, his army, and the senators, and they run from Caesar down through southern Italy. They're not going to be in Rome to challenge him when Caesar arrives. They don't want to do it. They figure they need time to think, to plan out some sort of strategy. They're not ready for Caesar. So they run and retreat. When Caesar marches into Rome, he marches in unchallenged and claims the title of consul. The Roman people back him in this and begin to question whether or not Pompey is the best leader, or is it Caesar? The Roman people aren't quite sure. They know they like Caesar better. So Caesar gives chase to Pompey. He chases him down through southern Italy, right down to the very toe and heel of Italy. Italy, of course, has a very distinctive shape. It looks like a tall boot. So Caesar chases Pompey right down into the toe and heel of the boot of Rome, of Roman territory, right down into southern Italy. And there, Pompey takes a fleet from more or less traders who had ports there, and he packs onto these confiscated ships all of his soldiers, the senators, and their families, and they take off for Greece. When Caesar arrives, just a few days later, he finds that there are no boats. All of the boats have been taken. Those that were left behind were in too bad of a shape to be seaworthy or had been burned. So Caesar and his men have to work to build ships before they can chase Pompey over to Greece. Meanwhile, in Greece, Pompey and his men prepare for Caesar's ultimate invasion of Greece. Caesar and his men work hard to build ships. They assemble a navy. They get on these ships. They head for Greece. Pompey chickens out, and he runs out of Greece. He actually gets on a boat himself and sails across the Mediterranean Sea down into Egypt. And when he arrives in Egypt, Pompey is looking for safe haven, some place that will give him solace, rest, a place to hide out from Caesar. Caesar, of course, and his men follow Pompey to Egypt. When Pompey and Caesar arrive in Egypt, they realize that they have gotten into Egypt in a very bad time period for Egypt. Pompey was first to arrive. Caesar came shortly thereafter. When Pompey arrived in Egypt, he discovered, just like Caesar would, that Egypt was in the midst of a civil war. Egypt at this point was ruled by a husband and wife who were also brother and sister. These co-rulers or co-pharaohs of Egypt were descendants of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. who would become king of Egypt after 40 years of fighting. That takes us back into chapter 4. So by this point, Ptolemy's descendants are ruling Egypt. So in other words, the Egyptian pharaohs are in fact Greek or Macedonian, not Egyptian at all. These two co-rulers are Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th. This is the famous Cleopatra. You probably just heard of her referred to as Cleopatra before, but she was actually the 7th woman to rule Egypt by that name. So Cleopatra the 7th and Ptolemy the 13th were brother and sister, husband and wife, co-pharaohs of Egypt. There is no evidence, in fact, evidence contradicts this idea. There's no evidence that Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th were married in what we could say is every aspect of that word. There is no indication of any sort of sexual relationship between this husband and wife, brother and sister. In fact, they hated each other. Cleopatra was much older, much smarter, much more capable than her brother of ruling Egypt. Ptolemy was in his early teens, very inexperienced, a bit of a crier, a bit immature for his age. These two were fighting against each other for sole control of Egypt. Ptolemy just so happened to be winning when Pompey and then Caesar arrived in Egypt. Cleopatra had been defeated for the time being and was held up in the desert just outside of Alexandria, Egypt, of course named for Alexander the Great. And she was held up out there in the desert with soldiers and Egyptian citizens who were loyal to her. Her brother/husband, co-pharaoh, Ptolemy the 13th, was in control of the royal palace. So, both of these individuals, Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th, knew about the problems unfolding in Rome. Rome and Egypt were great trading partners at this time. Boats, ships I should say, were continually going back and forth on a month-long journey across the Mediterranean from Egypt to Rome and back again. Egypt, you'll remember from a previous lecture, was called the gift of the Nile because they always had a surplus of food, more than they needed. Well, in this time period, the period of the Roman Republic, Egypt earned the nickname bread basket of the Mediterranean. So Rome and Egypt were trading partners. Egypt was making a lot of money off of selling grain to Rome. And of course, with these ships of grain and money selling back and forth, news was exchanged between Rome and Egypt. So Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th knew about the first triumvirate, knew about the power struggle between Pompey and Caesar. So when Pompey arrives in Egypt, he finds Ptolemy the 13th in control of the royal palace at Alexandria, and he asks Ptolemy the 13th for safe haven. Will you please give me a place to stay? Will you help protect me from Caesar? Ptolemy the 13th tells Pompey, yes, certainly, stay here, seek refuge here, no problem whatsoever. Now, Ptolemy the 13th has an idea in mind. Looking at these two guys, Caesar and Pompey, who would you hedge your bets on? Who would you think is going to win this? Is it going to be Caesar? Is it going to be Pompey? Well, what we know about Pompey so far is that he's run from Caesar. Seems a bit cowardly. So Ptolemy the 13th is thinking the same things we are right now. Ptolemy the 13th is looking at Caesar, Pompey, who's going to win this thing? I need an ally against my sister. Who am I going to place my bet on? Which of these two guys would be the better ally for me? And he makes up his mind real quickly. It's Caesar. So what he does is he tells Pompey, sure, stay here at the palace. And then he gives orders to one of his servants to have Pompey's head removed. In other words, he gives orders to decapitate, behead Pompey. The head is quickly mummified and placed on a silver platter, just waiting until Caesar arrives. Well, Caesar shows up in Egypt, and he comes to the royal palace at Alexandria, and he asks Ptolemy the 13th, "Have you seen my enemy? Tell me where to find him. I want to hunt him down. I want to kill him. I want this over and done with. I need to get back to Rome so that I can rule as the consul of Rome." Ptolemy the 13th tells him, "Oh, sure, I know where he is. In fact, he's here. I'll bring him to you." So Caesar waits for the chance to meet his enemy finally in person, the man who had been his ally in 59 BC, now his enemy. He's anxious. He wants to kill him. He wants this thing to be over with. Ptolemy the 13th brings out this huge silver platter with a mummified head of Pompey on it and presents it to Caesar. Ptolemy the 13th thought that by presenting this head, he would win the respect and alliance with Caesar. But the presentation of this decapitated head to Caesar did not have the effect that Ptolemy the 13th had intended. Caesar was sickened by the sight and really lost his temper, became extremely angry. Some say that he grew teary-eyed and even weak in voice because he was so angry. As you can imagine, this was probably an insult to his manhood and a big letdown to think that he wouldn't have the joy and glory of killing his enemy himself. It had been done for him by a little teenage boy, and it was very upsetting to him that this had happened. So Ptolemy the 13th realized, got to do something else, because he judged the reaction of Caesar to not be a favorable one. And what Caesar said here is, Veni, veni, vici, which means I came, I saw, I conquered. Not exactly, he came, he saw, but his enemy had been conquered for him. He felt himself, that is Caesar, felt himself growing very weak and tired and stressed, of course. And Caesar had recognized about himself that his falling down disease became more acute when he was tired and under stress. So he asked Ptolemy the 13th if he could stay at the palace of Alexandria to rest and recuperate. Ptolemy the 13th, of course, is desperate to win Caesar as an ally. Sure. I know exactly the best place to put you in the palace. It's my sister and wife, co-pharaoh, Cleopatra's bedroom. It's the most opulent place in the palace. That's where I'll put you up. Caesar didn't really care. He just wanted some place to rest and relax for a while before he headed back to Rome. So Caesar goes to Cleopatra's abandoned bedroom. Remember, she's in the desert. And he rests and waits until he is ready to head back to Rome. Meanwhile, out in the desert outside of Alexandria, Cleopatra receives news that Caesar and Pompey had arrived, and her spies from inside the palace tell her, "Your brother/husband has made a huge mistake. He gave Caesar Pompey's head, and it upset him. And what he's trying to do, of course, is to get an alliance with Caesar, and Caesar is in the palace right now." And Cleopatra, of course, has been thinking all along that she would like an ally from Rome as well, and she knew for sure that it would have to be Caesar, that he was definitely the more powerful of these two guys. But the problem for her is how to get back to the palace. After all, there are all these soldiers that are loyal to her brother and husband in between her and Caesar. So what to do? Well, she comes up with a plan. And that is, she gets nude, and does her makeup really well, puts on a little perfume, lots of jewelry, does her hair up really nice, and rolls herself up in a carpet And she consulted with a prostitute beforehand. Anywhere there are soldiers, there are prostitutes. And so servicing the soldiers that were loyal to Cleopatra were many prostitutes, but there was one that was most popular. And she consulted with this prostitute, and she said, "Can you give me some advice for the meeting I'm going to have with Caesar? Cleopatra's intention is quite clear. If she can survive being carried in a rug across the desert, she intends to seduce Caesar when she meets him, and that way win him over. To offer him something more or less that her brother could not." So the prostitute gave her some advice. Here, there are different versions of the story. Some historians have suggested that Cleopatra needed the advice because she had never been experienced in these matters. Others say that she didn't need any advice whatsoever, that she was very experienced. We don't know the answer to that question. Only Caesar and Cleopatra know the answer to that question. So Cleopatra gets some advice, or maybe not need it really, who knows, but she talks with the prostitute, gets herself all done up, rolled up in the carpet, and has her trusted servants carry her across the desert in this rug to the palace. The rug is presented to Ptolemy the 13th. This all seems a little screwy to me, to be honest, like you couldn't tell somebody was rolled up in the carpet, but whatever. The rug is presented to Ptolemy the 13th, and the servants say this is a gift from Cleopatra to Caesar. It's a rug. She just wants to give him this rug. She understands that you are winning. She's not trying to undermine you or anything like that. She just wants to give him a gift. Ptolemy the 13th says, "Sure, what harm can there be in a rug?" Well, a lot. So Cleopatra's carried inside the rug to her bedroom where Caesar is held. And Caesar is accompanied by many of his trusted commanders at this point, and they all notice that something seems a little weird about the rug, that it's kind of misshapen, not rolled the way a rug traditionally would be for carrying and storage, and it smells rather nice too, like a lady's perfume. So they asked Caesar, would he like them to inspect the rug? And they offer to stab it with daggers. And of course the servants who have carried in this rug quickly intervene. "Oh, no, this is a precious rug. It's really a great rug. You don't want to hurt it. You don't want to do that. You don't want to stab the rug." Caesar was smirking because he was on to it. Something was going on with the rug. He and his men could see that. And the servants of Cleopatra speak up and say, no, this rug is very delicate. It's very beautiful. It was brought here by us under great protection. We have been instructed to tell you to only open this rug, Caesar, when you were alone. And of course, Caesar's trusted friends and commanders are looking at him like this seems suspicious. "We don't think you should be alone with the rug when you open it. There may be an assassin inside it." Caesar dismissed the servants of Cleopatra and his men and walked over to the rug and looked at it, and then quickly noticed some movement within, and in a very dramatic moment, Cleopatra unrolls herself from this rug. You imagine roll over, and then there she is, lying on the rug in all of her naked splendor and glory, and she offers herself to Caesar and offers an alliance between Egypt and Rome, which Caesar, of course, takes. Well, the next morning, Ptolemy the 13th had finally worked up enough courage to see Caesar directly and just ask him straight up for an alliance. So he knocks on the door to Cleopatra's bedroom, where Caesar is. Cleopatra's in the desert, right? So he knocks on the door, Caesar says, "Come in," and Ptolemy the 13th throws open the door, and in like a couple of seconds realizes, oh no, what has all happened here? Because there's Cleopatra, who's supposed to be in the desert, sitting in Caesar's lap in a very intimate gesture, stroking his balding head and kissing him on the neck and cheek. Ptolemy realized at that point it was a lost cause. It was all over for him. Cleopatra had won, so he left running, screaming, and crying out of the palace, and a few days later turned up mysteriously drowned in the Nile. Of course, Cleopatra and Caesar were behind this. Caesar now felt it was time to leave Egypt and head back to Rome, but he asked Cleopatra to join him as soon as she could in Rome, that he had enjoyed their time together and would like to show her the sights and sounds of Rome. And she was definitely interested in doing this and told him that she had a little work herself to do before she could join him, of course. You know, she had to solidify her control of Egypt in this civil war once and for all, defeat her brother's supporters, make Egypt peaceful, and then she could join Caesar in Rome, and she promised that she would. We should point out at this point that Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BC. So when she and Caesar met, Cleopatra was about 21 years old and Caesar was about 52. Caesar left for Rome, got back to Rome, solidified his control of Rome as the consul of Rome, and then began to make some changes, which I'll come back to in just a second. Cleopatra had her work cut out for her in Egypt, and then she started to feel ill, and her trip to Rome was delayed. When she finally joined Caesar in Rome, she did not come alone. Of course, she had an entourage of makeup and hair people because Cleopatra was very concerned about her appearance. And I'll just tell you at this point, most of you probably envision Cleopatra as a beautiful seductress. Well, she was definitely seductive, whatever it was about her, but she was not a beautiful woman. That is the stuff of legend. She was average at best, but knew how to work everything she had going for her. Certainly her intelligence, she spoke 9 languages, her wealth, her power, and her figure certainly helped. She was not a beautiful woman in the face, but she was very adept at making herself look her best. Men who saw Cleopatra never commented on her looks. What they said about her was she was very intelligent, a good conversationalist, a lot of fun to hang around with, had a beautiful singing voice. So I think you probably can figure that she was not an especially attractive woman if they're focusing in on personality traits like this in the descriptions of her, and you see the busts of her and coins of her. She is not an attractive woman. So why do we think she is? Well, generations of historians have led us to believe that she was seductive, and the paintings that they have given to us of her portray her as being beautiful. I guess because historians were not comfortable with thinking that their heroes, men like Caesar and then later Mark Antony, would risk their lives and control of Rome on an ugly woman. But the actual images of her time do not show her to be attractive. But Cleopatra arrived with an entourage of hair and makeup people and servants and an infant son named Caesarion, or Little Caesar, or you could probably even stretch it and say Caesar Jr., you know. So when she arrives in Rome with this little baby boy calling Caesar, the Roman people are shocked and horrified. Roman people do not believe in messing around with non-Roman people. They loved Caesar, but the fact that he had brought into Rome this foreign queen who apparently had a child with him was a bit too much for some of them, and some of them fell away from Caesar, didn't like him so much anymore. Others thought, well, we still respect him and admire him, but, we wish he hadn't done that. What also bothers the Roman people about Caesar at this time is that he is already married to a Roman woman. Caesar was married 3 times in his life. At this point, when Cleopatra arrives, Caesar is married to his 3rd wife, a sweet woman named Calpurnia, who the Roman people really liked because she was so sweet and kind and did a lot of volunteer and charitable kinds of activities. And they thought, this is just terrible. Caesar is keeping this foreign woman, Cleopatra, as his mistress in one of his palaces just outside the city. He's favoring her over his wife. He doesn't spend time with his wife. He's neglecting her, taking this foreign queen around, parading her everywhere, throwing parties in her honor, having statues erected of her all around Rome, proclaiming her a goddess on earth. This was a little much for them. When Caesar arrived back in Rome, he had defeated Pompey. Pompey had been defeated in 48 BC. I guess we would probably agree that Caesar did not defeat Pompey, but Ptolemy the 13th had done it for him. So Caesar, much as the Senate had suspected, reveals his true colors now that Pompey is out of the picture. Caesar proclaims himself dictator. Not dictator for 6 months or just in time of emergency, but dictator. Then in 44 BC, he calls himself dictator for life. In January of 44 BC, he changed his title to dictator for life. The Senate was biding its time. What should we do? We know this is not right. We know it's a great threat to the Roman way of life, but he's so popular. If we assassinate him, won't the people of Rome then turn on the Senate? What to do? And so behind the scenes, many of the senators started to plot against Caesar. And remember, some of them had been humiliated by their wives throwing themselves at Caesar anyway because he was quite the ladies' man. So what to do about this, they're not sure, but they know they don't like it. Caesar takes to doing things like sitting on what appears to be a throne chair. This is something that a king would do when he was addressing the Senate. And on one occasion, Caesar threw a triumph, as he called it, or a parade for himself. Look at me, look at what great things I've done. I've defeated Pompey, etc., etc. And at one point during this parade, Caesar's best friend, a commander in his army by the name of Mark Antony, ran up to Caesar during this parade and tried to put a crown on Caesar's head. He's like, no, and he rejected and tried to push Mark Antony away. Just don't do that. You're going to cause me all kinds of problems. He probably did want to be king, but he could not stand at that point for that kind of thing to be so obvious, so public, because he needed to give the Roman people time to warm up to the idea. So the Senate saw all of this and worried, but waited. In 44 BC, Caesar proclaims himself dictator for life. This is in January. By March 15th, 44 BC, the Roman Senate knew they had to act. For some reason or the other, we're not quite sure, Caesar had opted to spend a couple of nights with his wife and left Cleopatra. She was outside the city of Rome in a palace, well taken care of. But Caesar had decided to pay a visit to his wife Calpurnia, and he spent a couple of nights with her, including the night of March 14th. Well, on the morning of the 15th of March, Caesar got dressed in a purple toga as a sign of his great wealth. He would never have worn a white toga, only purple for him because it was very expensive to make a purple toga. The dye was outrageously expensive. He got dressed, put on the purple toga, put on a wreath of gold leaves that looked very much like a crown, and was about to head out the door when his wife, Calpurnia, fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around Caesar's legs and tried to prevent him from leaving. And what she told him was, "I've been having these dreams. I don't know what they mean, but I see you lying in a pool of blood. Please do not leave. Beware the Ides of March." Ides of March means March 15th, middle March. Historians have long wondered, was Calpurnia really psychic or what? Probably not. She knew how the Roman Senate felt about her husband, and she was under a great deal of stress, and this stress probably showed up in her dreams, gave her nightmares about what might be in store for her husband. So she begged and pleaded with him, "Please do not leave. Beware the Ides of March. I see you in a pool of blood. This cannot be good." Caesar pushed her off, called her a superstitious woman, and he says, "The Ides of March have come, and I'm still standing." And she said, "Yes, but they have not gone." Caesar ignored her, pushed her aside, and headed to the Forum, where he was due for a meeting with the Roman Senate to discuss various laws that were up for debate and passage. Caesar walked through the Forum, through a crowd. In this crowd was an informant. The informant handed him a little scroll, and on this scroll were written 60 names of senators who had been plotting against Caesar. Caesar took the scroll, did not read it, stuck it in the folds of his purple toga, and walked inside. So Caesar really received 2 warnings about what might be waiting inside for him. He ignored them. I don't know if that's arrogance or cockiness or just general misunderstanding of the climate in Rome at the time, but he marched into the Forum, sat down on his throne chair with his big gold crown on his head, and what normally happened is when he took his seat, the senators sat out of respect. He would open up the meeting, call it to order, and then discussion would start. When he sat down in his chair that day, the senators did not sit as was custom. Instead, a group of about 60 of them, there are 300 total, came out of the seats and surrounded him, and he asked them to take his seat. He probably figured something was up, that this was strange, but if he knew what was coming, we don't know that. He asked these 60 members to take their seats. They refused, and essentially what they did is they formed a big throng or block around Caesar that prevented other senators from coming to Caesar's rescue, those who were still in support of Caesar or those who were against an assassination. So this 60 block, 60 members strong, stood around Caesar, encircled him, and then proceeded to remove daggers from their togas and stab Caesar to death on March 15th, 44 BC, in the Roman Senate building. Caesar died as a result of 23 stab wounds, which of course lets you know that not all 60 members participated in the stabbing of Caesar. In his final moments, Caesar had enough consciousness about him that he looked around at the crowd of his assassins. Blood was spilling out of his body. He was close to death, but he looked around at the faces who were responsible, taking it all in. And as he looked around there was one face that stood out from the crowd to him, and it was the face of a young man named Brutus. Brutus and Caesar had had a very close relationship. Caesar had mentored Brutus, had trained him in the Roman ways, had taken him in as sort of like a protege, as a Caesar in training, so to speak, as a favor to Brutus's mother, who was rumored to be one of Caesar's lovers. Some had dared suggest even that Brutus might have been a child of Caesar. But the two had been very close friends. In fact, many senators had mockingly picked at Brutus, joked with him, "Oh, you're the son of a dictator, you're Caesar's son." And it's something that apparently bothered Brutus to be joked with in that way, because he was committed to the Roman Republican system. As much as he loved Caesar, he did not support Caesar's dictatorship for life or kingship. So standing there in the crowd as one of the assassins was Brutus. And what Caesar said to Brutus was not, "You too, Brutus," that's the stuff of literature. What he said to Brutus was, "And you, Brutus, my son?" Now, how do you take that? Was this an admission of Caesar that Brutus was in fact his child? Or did Caesar know that Brutus had been the butt of jokes and this was his last quote-unquote stab at Brutus? I'm going to give you something that's going to worry you for the rest of your life. Were you my son or were you not? I called you my son in my final dying moment. This is something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. The not knowing whether I was or wasn't, and whether or not you participated in patricide, murdering your father. The last act of Caesar was that he reached down with his final bit of strength and he pulled his purple toga up around his face so that his assassins were denied seeing him take his final breath. When word of Caesar's assassination spread through Rome, the Roman people were upset. Caesar had done great things for Rome, including relieving the debt of the poor, forgiving debts of the poor, increasing employment in Rome through various building projects, by increasing the size of the army, by building roads. He had also reworked the calendar of Rome, which I'll just tell you is called the Julian calendar, and it's the calendar that we use today with minor modifications. It was a solar calendar. Caesar had changed some of the workings of that calendar to harmonize the seasons and the dates on the calendar. And while he was at it, named a month after himself, July, of course. And Caesar had brought many colonies into Rome: Spain, Gaul, Greece, and parts of Africa, which he had given to veterans. Veterans who had served him in the Roman Republic were given good paying government jobs in Spain, Gaul, Greece, and parts of Africa. So the Roman people, though they were upset with Caesar's parading around with Cleopatra, a foreign woman, and with the whole dictator for life stuff, they were warming up to the idea of Caesar as king because they thought he was so capable and so accomplished. So when word spread throughout Rome that Caesar had been assassinated, the Roman people were upset, freaked out, angry, and they demanded that Caesar be given a proper burial. So in true Roman fashion, Caesar's body was taken to a funeral pyre. Piles and piles of sticks, logs were set up. Caesar's body lay in state for the Roman people to come by and pay their respects, and then his body was burned. He was cremated. That was the way the Romans got rid of dead bodies. After Caesar was burned on the funeral pyre, a funeral oration or elegy was delivered by Caesar's best friend, his right-hand man, his most trusted advisor and general and commander in Caesar's army, Mark Antony. Mark Antony stood and said something to the effect of, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, for I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." So in his funeral oration, or in his eulogy of Caesar, Mark Antony did not glorify Caesar totally. He talked about some of the faults of Caesar. He admitted that Caesar had some problems or some issues, but that when the final tally was taken, he was more good than bad. When he finished the funeral speech, Mark Antony read the last will and testament of Julius Caesar, and there were many people in the crowd who were interested to see where all of Caesar's millions would go, and there were some in the crowd who thought they stood a good chance of getting some of it. Mark Antony thought he would be named in the will somehow, some way. Cleopatra thought she would, and certainly her son Caesarion would be also, and of course Calpurnia, the third wife. But people were shocked by the contents of the will. What Caesar said in his will is that he was leaving a home and enough money to Calpurnia that she would never have to marry again if she didn't want to. But everything else, all his other homes, he had multiple homes, all of his money, his closet full of purple togas, his jewels, everything, he was leaving to his grandnephew, a young man named Octavian. And he says, by this will and testament, Octavian is now my son. I adopt him with this will and leave everything to him, including control of Rome. Well, this caused some murmuring in the crowd. Rome was not a personal possession of Julius Caesar. This statement shows that what the Senate assassinated Caesar for was actually accurate, because what the Senate feared is that Caesar wanted to be king. If Caesar is saying in his will that he leaves Rome to his now son, Octavian, he was attempting to be a king. A king inherits control over his kingdom through the father. So Caesar was in his will trying to make his now son king of Rome. People were shocked by the choice of Octavian. What they knew about Octavian was not especially positive. He was young and relatively inexperienced. Why not Mark Antony, who had served Caesar in Gaul and in all of his exploits, even down into Egypt and Greece? Why not Mark Antony? Well, it's probably because Caesar knew that Mark Antony was not the most brilliant man, that Mark Antony had a couple of major problems. He was not an idea guy. He was a follower, not a leader. And also, he was a raging alcoholic. So why not Caesarion? Well, the problem with Caesarion is that at Caesar's death, Caesarion is not quite 3 years old. A 3-year-old can't rule Rome. That would have given Cleopatra the opportunity to say she should rule Rome, and that's not going to work at all. The Romans are interested in acquiring territory, not giving up their territory to a foreign queen. That would never work. There's also something else here playing in that I haven't told you, and this gets into a little bit of mature subject matter, so if you need to pause or whatever here to make sure that no one hears this information who you don't want to hear it. Because if you're still with me, I'll just go ahead here. The Romans had invented a birth control method that we still use today called condoms, and these were sheep bladders. They also invented you could almost call it like a birth control gum. It was a leaf of a certain plant. You don't have to worry about that. But the Romans had such an appetite for this birth control plant that they looked for it everywhere they went when they conquered new territory. And the Romans ate that plant off the face of the planet. So birth control methods were available to the Romans. Caesar himself was not known to use birth control. he had been with countless numbers of women, and in his whole life had only produced one child, and that was in the first couple of years of his first marriage, and that was a daughter, Julia. And after that, despite all of the women that he had conquered, quote unquote, Caesar never fathered another child. Now, somebody somewhere would have gotten pregnant. I mean, there's no way that he would have been that lucky not to have impregnated one of his mistresses, okay? He never produced another child. And Caesar apparently thought, and he had confided into some of his closest friends, that he thought himself to be sterile, that possibly he had suffered an injury of some sort after his first child was produced, maybe some sort of battle injury or something that had left him unable to produce children. So when Cleopatra showed up with cesarean, it's quite likely that Caesar did not believe that he was the father of that child. I mean, he would have had to have gotten extremely, miraculously lucky after all of these decades of not having children to suddenly have a child with Cleopatra. So in some ways, in this wheel, Caesar is kind of calling out Cleopatra, you know, this child is not mine. He doesn't say that, but he is definitely not recognizing Caesarion as his heir. So who was Caesarion then if he was not the son of Caesar? And this gets us into something here to just think about. I mean, would a woman do that? Would a woman get herself pregnant and try to pass the child off as someone else's for some reason or the other? Well, yes, we know that happens. Cleopatra may have seen an opportunity when Caesar left Egypt to get herself impregnated by any of the Romans who were trading in Egypt. You know, who knows? This is the stuff of speculation, but it would have been very easy for her to get a Roman off of one of these ships coming to get grain, you know, have her way with him, make sure that she was impregnated, and then throw this guy in prison or kill him so that he could never spill the secret or whatever. And that way the child would look Roman. Why would Cleopatra get herself pregnant and try to pass off a child as Caesar's? This would be the best way for her to ensure that Caesar and she would remain allies if they shared a child. So she apparently did not know Caesar's secret. So when Caesar died in 44 BC, he leaves everything, including control of Rome, to his former grandnephew, now his son Octavian. And we will talk about Octavian and his heirs in our next lecture.